December 24, 1984, Munich, Germany. Inside Musicland Studios, Freddie Mercury was recording the Works album. Outside, across the frozen street, a 70-year-old man with blue fingers played accordion to absolutely no one. When Freddie looked out the window, he saw something that made him abandon 6 hours of recording time. 34 years later, a napkin found in a dead man's pocket would reveal why Freddie called it the greatest session he never finished. Hans Müller had been invisible for exactly 6 years. Once he had been first violin in the Bavarian State Opera Orchestra, performing for sold-out crowds in Munich's most prestigious concert hall. But in 1978, his wife died suddenly, and grief broke something fundamental inside him. His hands began to shake during performances. The tremor was subtle at first, but within months, he could no longer hold a bow steady enough to play professionally. The orchestra dismissed him with a pension that barely covered rent. Without his wife, without his violin, without his identity as a musician, Hans descended into a darkness he couldn't name. By 1984, arthritis had twisted his fingers so severely that even if the tremor disappeared, he could never play violin again. So he bought a cheap accordion from a pawn shop and taught himself to play it on the streets. Not for the art, not for joy. Just to feel like a musician again, even if nobody was listening. On Christmas Eve 1984, Hans stood under his usual lamppost across from Musicland Studios, playing Bach's Air on the G string to absolutely no one. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius. His fingerless gloves did nothing against the cold. Every few minutes he had to stop playing to blow warm breath onto his blue-tinged fingers. People hurried past, wrapped in heavy coats, their faces buried in scarves, not one of them glancing at the old man with the accordion. His dented tin can sat empty on the snow-dusted pavement. 6 years of playing on this corner, and he had learned that on Christmas Eve, people were too busy rushing toward their own celebrations to notice someone who had nowhere to go. Hans didn't know that across the street, through the thick studio windows, someone was watching him. Inside Musicland Studios, Queen had been working on the Works album for 3 months. The sessions were tense. Freddie Mercury had spent the last 4 hours trying to nail the perfect vocal take for Who Wants to Live Forever, a song that dealt with mortality, love, and the cruel brevity of human existence. He was in the vocal booth, headphones on, about to start another take, when he glanced through the control room window. Beyond the glass, beyond the street, he saw the old man under the lamppost. Freddie watched him stop playing, blow on his hands, and then force himself to continue. The accordion's bellows expanded and contracted. The old man's shoulders were hunched against the cold. Not a single person stopped. Freddie pulled off his headphones mid-note. "I need air, darlings," his voice came through the intercom suddenly. "Now." Brian May looked up from his guitar. "Freddie, we've almost got it. Just 2 more takes," I said now. Freddie was already out of the booth, heading for the exit. Roger Taylor exchanged glances with Brian. They'd seen Freddie stressed before, but this was different. This was urgent. The studio's security guard, Klaus, intercepted Freddie at the door. "Mr. Mercury, it's not safe to go out alone. Let me call the car." Freddie stopped and looked at Klaus with an expression the guard had never seen before. Not anger, something deeper. "That man out there is playing like nobody's listening, like he's already a ghost." Freddie's voice was quiet but intense. "I used to play piano in my father's restaurant when I was young. Nobody cared. Nobody looked. I played to empty rooms while people ate their dinners and ignored me completely. I know exactly what that feels like." He put his hand on Klaus's shoulder. "I'm going out there. You can watch from the window if you're worried." Then Freddie pushed through the door into the freezing Munich night. Hans was midway through Air on the G string when he heard footsteps stop beside him instead of hurrying past. He didn't look up. Experience had taught him that people who stopped usually wanted to tell him to move along, that his music was disturbing them. But then a voice, gentle and warm despite the frozen air, said, "That's beautiful. Bach, isn't it?" Hans looked up and saw a man in an expensive black coat and aviator sunglasses standing 3 feet away. The man had a distinctive mustache and an air of quiet intensity that made Hans forget about the cold for a moment. "Yes," Hans replied in German-accented English. "Air on the G string. I love that piece. The man crouched down so he was at Hans's eye level despite the snow. But you're playing it on accordion, which is much harder than violin. That takes real skill. Hans felt something crack inside his chest. 6 years of being invisible, and this stranger was the first person to acknowledge not just that he was playing, but what he was playing and how difficult it was. I used to play violin, Hans said, his voice rough. But my hands... He held up his twisted, arthritic fingers. The man with the mustache looked at Hans's hands with an expression of profound understanding. Then he did something Hans never expected. He started to sing. Softly at first, matching the melody of Hans's accordion, the man began humming air on the G string with perfect pitch and remarkable control. His voice filled the cold air with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Hans's fingers found their rhythm again, playing with more confidence now that he wasn't performing alone. Within 30 seconds, people began to stop walking. Within a minute, a small crowd had formed. Within 2 minutes, someone gasped, "My God, that's Freddie Mercury." Hans's fingers faltered when he heard the name. He looked at the man crouching beside him with new eyes. This wasn't just any stranger showing kindness to an old street musician. This was one of the most famous rock stars in the world. But Freddie didn't acknowledge the growing crowd. He just kept humming, kept encouraging Hans with small nods, kept making the old accordion player feel like his music mattered. Inside Musicland Studios, Brian May and Roger Taylor had pressed their faces against the window. "Is that Freddie?" Roger whispered. "Singing on the street with a homeless man," Brian confirmed, already grabbing his coat, "on Christmas Eve." They rushed downstairs, but not to stop him. They understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't about Freddie needing air or having a breakdown. This was about something deeper than any recording session could ever touch. When Brian and Roger emerged onto the street, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people. Some were filming on early camcorders. Others were simply standing in the snow, witnessing something they knew they'd remember forever. Brian pulled a coin from his pocket and began tapping it against a lamppost, creating a subtle rhythm. Roger clapped his hands softly, keeping time. The other Queen members had joined the spontaneous street performance without a word. Hans's accordion suddenly didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like the centerpiece of something magical. The empty tin can at Hans's feet began to fill with money. Paper bills, not just coins. People weren't just stopping to watch. They were contributing like this was the most important concert they'd ever attend. When the piece ended, the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the buildings. Hans sat on his small, folding stool, tears freezing on his cheeks, unable to process what had just happened. Freddie knelt in the snow beside him, completely ignoring the cold and damp seeping through his expensive trousers. "What's your name?" Freddie asked gently. "Hans. Hans Müller." "Hans, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Freddie's voice was intense but kind. "You're not playing for coins. You're playing for eternity. We record songs in that studio." He gestured across the street. "But you record humanity. You remind people that music exists outside of studios and stages, that it lives in the cold, in the struggle, in the moments when nobody's watching. Never stop playing. Promise me." Hans couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears flowing freely now. Freddie reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a paper napkin from the studio's break room. He borrowed a pen from someone in the crowd and crouched down, using his knee as a writing surface. He wrote quickly, then folded the napkin and pressed it into Hans's shaking hands. "Don't read this now," Freddie said quietly, making sure the crowd couldn't hear. "Read it when you're alone. And remember, you warmed my soul tonight when the world was freezing." Then Freddie stood, squeezed Hans's shoulder once, and walked back toward the studio with Brian and Roger following. The crowd slowly dispersed, but many people stopped to put more money in Hans's tin can and thank him for the music. For the first time in 6 years, Hans felt seen. When he was finally alone again, Hans carefully unfolded the napkin with his twisted fingers. On one side, in elegant handwriting, "Your music warmed my soul when the world was freezing. FM." Hans turned the napkin over. On the back was the studio's address and a longer message. "If you ever need anything at all, you come here. You don't play for coins. You play for eternity. We record songs. You record humanity. Never stop. Freddie Hans folded the napkin carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, right against his heart. He never went to the studio. Something told him that wasn't what Freddie really meant. The address wasn't an invitation to ask for help. It was proof that someone believed his music mattered. That was worth more than any amount of money. Hans continued playing on that corner every evening until his death in 1989. But something fundamental had changed after that Christmas Eve. He no longer played hoping someone would stop. He played because Freddie Mercury had told him he was playing for eternity, and he believed it. People noticed the change. Hans's music became something the neighborhood talked about. The old man under the lamppost who played with such soul that even on the coldest nights, you'd see small crowds gathered around him. In 1985, a young pregnant couple stopped to listen. The woman told Hans, "The baby dances in my belly when you play." That was enough. In 1987, a teenage boy who was failing music school stood listening for 20 minutes, then came back the next night to ask Hans for advice. Hans taught him for free every Tuesday evening under that lamppost. In 1989, when Hans collapsed while playing and died before the ambulance arrived, more than 200 people attended his funeral. They were neighbors, strangers who'd stopped to listen, students he'd mentored on street corners, and people whose lives had been touched by an old man with an accordion who played like he was performing in a concert hall. On top of Hans's coffin was a single item, a yellowed napkin in a simple frame. The story should have ended there. But in 2018, Hans's granddaughter Emma was cleaning out her late father's apartment when she found her grandfather's old accordion case. Hidden in a secret inner pocket was something Emma had never seen before. The original napkin, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve alongside a faded photograph of Hans playing under the lamppost. Emma didn't understand the FM signature. She posted the image on Reddit with the caption, "Found this in my grandfather's accordion case. Can anyone identify this signature from 1984? Within 3 hours, the post had 50,000 views and hundreds of comments, all saying the same thing. That's Freddie Mercury. The story exploded. Major news outlets picked it up. The Reddit thread became international news. 2 days later, Brian May saw the story and tweeted, "I remember that night. Munich, 1984, Christmas Eve. We watched from the studio window. I've never seen Freddie so peaceful. That old man's music saved our recording session. Without him, we couldn't have finished Who Wants to Live Forever." That song is about mortality and love and the brief beauty of human existence. Your grandfather taught us what those words actually meant. Ryan, the tweet was shared over 1 million times. Queen's official archive released a grainy black and white photograph taken from the studio window that night. Freddie crouched beside Hans in the snow, Brian tapping rhythm on the lamppost, Roger clapping, a crowd gathered in a circle, and Hans in the center with his accordion, looking up at Freddie with an expression of pure wonder. The photograph was titled, "The Recording Session That Mattered Most." Today, there's a small plaque on that Munich street corner where Hans used to play. It reads, "Here, Hans Müller played accordion from 1978-1989. On Christmas Eve 1984, Freddie Mercury stopped recording to listen. Both men understood, music exists not in studios or stadiums, but in moments of human connection. Hans's music lives forever in everyone who stopped to listen." The napkin is now displayed in the Bavarian State Opera Museum, donated by Emma. Beside it is Hans's accordion and the photograph from the studio window. Freddie Mercury lost 6 hours of recording time on Christmas Eve 1984. His producer was furious. The session ran over budget. Queen's management called it an expensive waste of valuable studio hours. But when Brian May talks about that night now, he says, "Freddie taught us something that evening. We thought we were making art in that studio. But art was happening across the street, in the cold, performed by an old man nobody noticed. Freddie saw him. And by seeing him, he reminded all of us what music is actually for." Freddie never mentioned that night in interviews. He never bragged about it. He never used it for publicity, because that wasn't the point. The point was that Hans Müller, first violin of the Bavarian State Opera Orchestra, who lost everything and became invisible, got to feel seen one more time before he died. Got to know that his music mattered. Got to believe that playing for empty sidewalks was still playing for eternity. And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this life, two musicians, one a rock star, one a street performer, probably understand that they taught each other the same lesson. Fame doesn't make music matter. Recording contracts don't make music eternal. Stadiums don't validate art. What makes music eternal is the moment when one human being stops walking past and actually listens. The moment when someone crouches in the snow and says, "That's beautiful." The moment when someone sees you. Freddie Mercury gave Hans Müller 90 minutes on a frozen Munich sidewalk. Hans gave Freddie the understanding that Who Wants to Live Forever wasn't just a song about mortality. It was about making sure that while we're here, we see each other. And 34 years later, a napkin in a dead man's pocket reminded the world that the best recording sessions are the ones that never get recorded at all.